Well, in an effort to respect everyone's time and the fact that we have so much information to get through in such a short amount of time, I think it's best that we go ahead and dive right in. So hello to everyone and welcome to today's webinar, Five Top Trends in Fair Housing for 2022. My name is Stephanie Anderson, and I'm the Senior Director of Communications and Social Media right here at Grace Hill. I want to thank you all for being here with us as we celebrate Fair Housing Month. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be shared with all registered attendees later this week. As an attendee, you will be in listen-only mode. This will help with any outside noises and disruptions so that everyone can hear today's presentation. If you have questions, please use that Q&A box located on your screen. I really want to encourage you to also engage in conversation using that chat box. This is a great way to connect with your peers and share some great ideas during today's presentation. Should you have any technical issues or need assistance, please message the virtual classroom and I am here to help you. At this time, I am thrilled to welcome my colleague and industry expert, Jessica Fern-Kirkland.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar. We've got a very exciting presentation ahead of us. And first, I would like to take a moment to welcome and thank our panelists today. Brian, Sue, and Mark are such a wonderful group of industry experts, and their time to prepare and collaborate in advance is so much appreciated. We've really put our heads together to tackle the industry's top fair housing trends to continue to provide you with just-in-time information first. So we have a packed agenda today covering fair housing's top 5 trends that include not only what you see on your screen here, but lots of cool topics. We're going to jump right in and we'll leave a few minutes at the end for Q&A. Okay, are we ready to do this? Fair Housing Month. All right. So let's start with trend 1, sexual harassment, which has been gaining attention since 2017 when the Department of Justice announced an initiative to combat sexual harassment in housing. The initiative recognizes quid pro quo and hostile environment harassment, and the Department of Justice is actively investigating complaints. Now, I think most people are familiar with quid pro quo. You do this for me, I do this for you. But what qualifies as hostile environment may be confusing. Brian, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the implications of sexual harassment in multifamily.
Sure. So the implications for multifamily are wide-ranging, especially with people being in and around their units during the shutdowns and stay-in-place orders. There are certainly more opportunities for interactions between neighbors, despite the social distancing requirements. But even before the pandemic, the number of complaints was trending upward with the Me Too movement, which helped to educate people on their rights and in realizing certain things that happened, that had happened to them for a long time were not okay. Multifamily is such a minefield for sexual harassment claims anyway, because you're dealing with people in and around their own homes, and they feel a sense of security there. So when they're sexually harassed, it can be very unnerving. Many times a complaint will come to you and you might think it's a relatively innocent comment about someone's appearance or what they're wearing. However, if comments happen over time, over a long period of time, it is making a resident feel like they're not safe in their home, it can lead to liability for your company. So as a housing provider, you have a duty of reasonable care and to take all reasonable steps to prevent harassment. So it's important that all of your employees are trained in identifying sexual harassment complaints and determining what will trigger an investigation. The threshold in triggering an investigation is fairly low in that regard. People hear the word investigation and think it's some large imposing thing, but it can be simple as speaking with the resident, speaking with the alleged offender, documenting what you spoke about with them, and then taking some sort of action after that. It could be as simple admonishment. We spoke with Bob about the behavior. Bob said he would not do it again. But make sure you document everything and don't wait to investigate. The best practices in the industry are to investigate claims of sexual harassment within 48 hours.
Awesome. Thank you for that overview. And Sue, I know you've got some great insights for operators as well, specifically around affordable housing.
Right. Yes. Thank you. I've actually sat at a couple of tables where we had to talk about sexual harassment incidences. I want to just key off of Brian's comment. The fact that sexual harassment issues, gender identity, have all been recently highlighted in the news. You'll find that if it's in the news, if we're talking about it in the news, it's going to have a massive impact on housing. It's just kind of a trickle, especially also if we're talking about it with employment. Today, we're not talking about employment, but it's a trickle down into housing. So in the affordable world, I'm not by any stretch of the imagination an affordable expert and certainly not an attorney, but here's what I have found. When we talk about affordable housing, we're talking about low-income households that are living in a great environment, but they're using a voucher. They're using some sort of a subsidy, some kind of permission, if you will, to have that portion or all of the rent paid for them. And you have to qualify for that. And a lot of our housing agencies, HUD particularly, has gotten tougher on pulling those vouchers if there's any misconduct, if there's any kind of issue. So an affordable housing client is going to be very, very desirous to keep that voucher, to keep that subsidy, because that's essential for them. So when we see management interact with one of those clients and force the issue of losing the voucher, for example, saying something like, I won't record your late rent, and perhaps have you lose that voucher if you'll go out to dinner with me. Or a service technician might not make a repair that's needed in the apartment unless the client, sleeps with them. And the client is, of course, very desirous to keep the voucher. So I think that those of you who provide service to affordable housing need to be very aware that there's a higher level of scrutiny that goes into people who are, enjoying the benefits of having subsidized housing.
Yeah, particularly vulnerable population. And you made a great point about service technicians also being included there. And Mark, I would love to hear your perspective on service technicians in sexual harassment housing.
Sure. The way that most service technicians prioritize their work when they come in is they meet with their supervisor, or they'll go through the list of work that's awaiting, and then they'll start to prioritize it. And occasionally you'll have people that cherry pick the work they want to do, or they have a preference of something. But if you consistently start prioritizing things, you have to be very careful if it's not a policy or a protocol or something that you can point to, because it can be perceived by someone based on interaction that you are now putting them at the bottom of the pile because of who they are, how they feel, or what they will or won't do for you. And it's interesting, if you talk to someone on site, the very technical things that take a lot of time usually are scheduled more earlier in the morning. So if you need to get something, you can later on. Smaller tasks a little bit. However, if someone knows there's an issue with a technician and a resident, and that person is consistently being the last person to get something done, it can be perceived as being discriminatory or sexual harassment in some nature. And the other thing is, if you think about this, just the basic language that we use. Hello, everyone. How are you guys? Good to see you. Good to see y'all. What's everybody up to? And, I'm from New York, and I say you guys all the time. And that means ladies and gentlemen and everyone included in the population. But that might not be the case. And I've personally seen where people have been addressed as you guys with the most innocent intentions, and person actually got upset and thought, how dare you call me that? And so if you look at some of the language, just be cautious of it, and also think about what it can imply, not just from you, but for everyone. And, I live in North Carolina. It is not uncommon at all for someone to just tell you their whole life story, put their hand on your shoulder and call you honey or sugar or a baby,
Yes.
It's just how it is. And you answer, you open the door, and they'll say, oh, thank you so much, sweetheart. Honey, that's very nice. And those pleasantries can be misperceived. So we have to just be aware of that when you're on site, that the things that you say that seem innocent to you may not always come across that way.
Thank you, Mark. Yeah, there's so many things that we are, working with and paying attention to that we never did before. So I know familial status has also been at the forefront with the reestablishment of inspections and skyrocketing housing prices. With community spaces being open, it also may be tempting to try and place restrictions on access by age. Brian, what can you tell us about trend 2?
So yeah, this has also been a landmine during the pandemic with rental housing prices skyrocketing, like you said, skyrocketing, and people sheltering in place with their families where they may not have normally been, as well as the lack of inspections of people going into units to inspect and see what's going on in them. So in California, there's it used to be the 2+1 rule, 2 people per bedroom plus 1. It's no longer a rule, it's kind of just a guide. You may have to conduct an individualized assessment of the unit, including the size, configuration of the unit, number of bedrooms, total living space, number of possible sleeping areas, any physical limitations of the home, and ages of children living in the home. There was a recent case in Bakersfield where DFVH filed a complaint against a company where a family of 12 was denied an opportunity to rent a 2,500 square foot home because they had too many kids. And DFVH found that they needed to do an individualized assessment rather than implying the 2+1 rule. So you may want to have an attorney review any house rules that you have, occupancy guidelines that you might have, determine whether any age-related community rules may violate the law as well. Such as curfews or not allowing a resident to play in the courtyard or ride their bike or skateboard. All these types of restrictions have been found to have a disparate impact on families with children and violate the law.
Thank you. I know there's always that fine balance between lease enforcement, community amenity enforcement, and letting everyone enjoy the premises and community spaces. So how can operators kind of manage that balance?
Well, and it's really interesting as keying again off of what Brian said, is that we as management, we are concerned that an 8-year-old riding a bike in the breezeway is going to end up out in a sidewalk and out in a driveway and perhaps hit by a car. And so we worry about that. So we set policies about that. And to Brian's point, those things are going to be found to be illegal simply because you can't specify an 8-year-old. Nonetheless, the law does give us some wiggle room with health and safety. So I really see that policy setting when we talk about familial status. Yes, it's an occupancy issue, but for many of us, it's a policy issue. I urge managers and management leadership to make the rule about the thing, not the person. Make the rule about the thing. You don't want diapers in the pool, but don't make that about a child in diapers. Make it about the diapers. You don't want a 70-year-old in diapers in the pool either. So be consistent there. You'll see on the screen a bullet that says the Nadine Green rule. The Nadine Green rule. Oh, it's not on that screen. Yes, it is. Community policies. So I have to explain who Nadine Green is very quickly. She was an attorney for rent for ages, for decades, literally. She recently retired, and she said, here's kind of a little tip. If you're thinking about writing a policy about youngsters, minor occupants under a certain age or whatever, she said, take that descriptor out and replace it with another protected class, like a Muslim or a Native American. And if the policy doesn't read right, then you haven't phrased it right yet. It's not it's obviously about the person and not about the thing. So I'm welcoming all the changes to pool rule signs. We're hearing a lot of discussion about that. And not stipulating age 14. I see some companies now doing minor non-swimmers must be accompanied by swimmers, adult swimmers, at all times while at the pool. And that takes away the age, and it also takes away the decision-making, because I'm the manager, I don't know whether you can swim or not. I have to defer that decision to somebody else. So policies are a challenge. And to Brian's point, I would absolutely run those by counsel.
Thank you. I know the maintenance team also has a high frequency of interaction with minors and work orders. And, that's been a long-aged industry issue and concern is, minors in the home when a work order is being done. And I would love to hear your thoughts, Mark, on the maintenance team and familial status.
Sure. It's oftentimes we knock on the door and you'll wait to see who opens it. And you'll just start a conversation. And if it's children, very often you're asked, is there an adult home or your parents here? And a lot of times the children are taught to say, no matter what, look, I'm at work. When someone knocks on the door, we need this, whatever this problem is, we need it fixed. When the person comes, just tell them I'm in the back sleeping or I'm in the bathroom, have them come in and do the work order and then leave. And so it puts us in this awkward position very often because you may need an adult. And do you really want to be in someone's home with minor children? And they could claim, who knows what they could claim or misunderstand or misinterpret or what could actually happen. And so a lot of times the children are basically taught and trained to just tell them that we're here. And oftentimes you could say, okay, I need to speak to an adult before I come in. And then they'll think, well, they're in the bathroom. Okay, I'll wait a couple of minutes. No worries. I'll come back in 15 or 20. And of course, there's no adult there. So I think it's absolutely worth having the conversation. And it's just something that parents don't consider very often because, or whoever they are, the adults in the home, they just want the problem to go away. And they don't think about the connotation, the context, the implications of things. And as a service technician, or someone on this call that works with technicians, just have the conversation like, what do you do if you have a feeling that there's no adults in the home? Do you go in? Do you leave? Do you reschedule? Do you let the person know when they call in the service request? So definitely take a look at your policies, and you'll hear us say this a few times throughout the call because it is that important. But make sure people know what to do when they interact, and when they interact, what they don't know, when they don't know what to do, what to do. So that would be my recommendation. And from my personal experience, that happens quite often.
Yeah, I was just going to piggyback off of that, Mark. Throughout this presentation, policies, procedures, documentation, and training are just essential in this business. You need to have updated policies and procedures every year, and make sure that you're doing training every year, at least every year, for customer service training on your policies and procedures as well.
Thank you. Yeah, consistency is key.
Mm-hmm.
So hoarding makes the list as trend 3 as unit inspections and backlog work orders settle into now a normal cadence. We anticipate that COVID-hidden hoarding or housekeeping issues may start to be discovered. Brian, I'd love to hear your perspective on hoarding trends.
So yeah, hoarding hasn't really been on my radar for a while, and it's because we haven't been doing inspections. We haven't experienced it as much during the pandemic. We're not entering units. As you start to enter units again, hoarding is going to be a hot button issue for you. Hoarding is a sign of disability, should be treated with care, likely with an attorney's advice. It's a double-edged sword because you don't want to discriminate against someone because of their mental disability, but at the same time, there are enormous health and safety concerns for that resident and the other residents at your property. So you want to make sure you address this issue and document all actions taken to remedy these issues.
And if I can key right off of that, Jessica, the big thing here is to not presume that because the apartment is an awful mess, that they have a hoarding disease. So, bad housekeeping is just bad housekeeping. And remember that in the definition for fair housing, there's that section that says regarded as. So don't presume that the person actually has a disability. They could just be a bad housekeeper. And you may not find out that they are claiming a disability until you're standing here in Texas in front of a JP's eviction court, and the person says, I'm sorry, I can't remove it. I just am, it's beyond me. I cannot remove it. And then you're going to have to step back and take a more cautionary approach.
Yeah, I'd like to just build on that for a moment. And that is that when you use real life situations and scenarios as learning tools, it fills in the gray areas of judgment. So if you're in a property and it's the first time in 2 years you've done inspections, let people know, hey, this is where we draw the line. And you'll start to notice that tendencies in your own behavior, like this is where I personally draw the line, as you need to let us know. But when you're not sure, report it, but don't report just 1 or 2 people, report everyone that hits that threshold, and then use real life circumstances as a learning opportunity. So everyone across the board is at least consistent, right or wrong.
That's a great idea.
And I think it would help a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know this group has been a huge advocate of policies and training, specifically making sure that both operations and maintenance receives training together of the same types. And hoarding is such a great example of how that can be exceptionally useful, because your maintenance team is your first line of defense with many lease violations that are only discovered when you're inside the unit. So helping them respond to hoarding or housekeeping and having those policies in place to bring it back to the manager so that can trigger an investigative response or a lease cure. That's so helpful in being able to have a consistent practice and policy to help steer clear of discriminatory practices. And I know that the threat of discrimination complaints, and probably now this webinar, is enough to keep most managers up at night. And in my experience, I've seen both real and false accusations. And there's no control over who files and for what reasons, but we can control our actions. And I would love to take a moment to hear your expertise on how people can protect themselves on site. Mark, why don't we start with the maintenance team?
Sure. So I think, Susan, this is basically what you said. I'll repeat it a little differently, is to correct the issue, right? Not the person, the human being. And so if you find a mess, state that it's a mess and leave the personal descriptors out of it. But something also to consider is if there's tension between a resident and a technician, it can easily grow into something that you don't want it to. So I think this is very important, and make sure that the residents know it's not retaliation. You're not giving them the hard time, that we're meeting standards, and whether you have software that you can upload photos and things like that. But I will say this, every day I am speaking with someone, false accusations are real, and they're used as a form of intimidation, retaliation, or whatever word you would like to use for it. But they have consequences and unintended consequences. And very often when people don't get their way, or they feel picked on or a little embarrassed because their home is messy and it was reported as possible hoarding, they can and they have retaliated. And I've seen that to the point where they want the person to lose their employment. And so if you're watching this, just please make sure that you follow a basic process protocol and that you really do get to the root of the matter, because the last thing you want to do is have good technicians with good intentions, following the rules, doing the right thing, being accused for things that they're not doing. And it's difficult to stay in an environment like that. And for anyone, it doesn't matter what it is. So report more, have evidence, use those scenarios, and make sure that people know that you're following the process, and be transparent with that process. And it will remove a lot of obstacles and unnecessary claims.
So protocol is really important, and I'm gonna key off of that too, Mark. It's a good thing we key off of everybody, right?
Yeah.
At one point in time, we actually wrote very, very like one sentence and a half scripts for maintenance technicians, simply because you're putting them in somebody's home and they get asked, or they get accused, or they just, to your point, they may get overshared, TMI. What do I say? What should I say? So equipping them just simply with some diversionary language, and then doing it consistently back to Mark's point. Protocol. If you're going to set policy, quit breaking your own policy. I had a manager once who had a resident, storm in the office and accuse the team of fair housing violations because their building was never cleared or cleaned in the morning promptly. And so he asked her to have a seat My manager asked her to have a seat, and he basically walked through the protocol of how the grounds are managed and picked up from clock in, from the time that the staff clocked in. Here's how we kind of, do things. And so, yeah, we oftentimes do not get to the part of the property where your building is located until, maybe 11 o'clock. The team is supposed to do it before they clock out for lunch. But he recited a protocol that was used consistently. She stood up, walked out, and he never heard from her again.
Yeah. Go ahead, Brian.
No, that's all right. I was just going to piggyback off of that and say, following protocol, having policies and procedures and following them and documenting that you followed them, there's good evidence in any court case or a government agency complaint. It's essential to have a policy. If you have a policy, follow it. If you follow your policy, definitely document that you followed your policy, and it'll be helpful in a case.
Yeah, and I would like to just use a little bit more of a specific example, and that is, Susan, kind of like you said, is have phraseology, phrases, things that people can reply with that really minimize them making it worse, and then redirect you to a resource. Like, for example, if you're asked something in while you're doing a service request, and people start having conversations, which they often do, and you're like, I don't really know what to say. Do you have things that you want people to say, and do they know them, and will they say them at the correct time? So have some basic language architecture, some phraseology in your replies, and then everyone should know where to redirect the person when it's outside of their skill set.
Yeah.
And one more thing, if you start breaking your own policies, that can actually work against you. Because any prosecuting attorney is going to say, oh, well, your policies don't mean too much, do they?
Yeah.
Right, Brian?
Yes, absolutely. And then, having all these things and training your employees on them. A lot of companies that I've worked with will separate their management, on-site management from their maintenance employees. I think it's important to have all of them have the same training to know what the left foot is doing, from the right foot. That wasn't the right analogy, but anyway, but yeah, have them all trained together regarding what the other side is doing so that everyone knows what to look for and how to document what to put in your documentation. So just to kind of summarize, it's, document some more, and, follow your own policies and procedures and train on them.
Wonderful. Now we only have a couple more topics before we get to COVID-related disabilities. We wanted to save the best for last, but one of which is just checking in on ADA website compliance. Brian, is it still a big concern?
Yes, it is. So website accessibility claims are the new and improved drive-by ADA claims. Like any type of claim, there are legitimate claims and illegitimate claims. I by no means want to minimize the legitimate claims. However, we're seeing a lot of illegitimate claims, and there was actually a law firm here in California that's getting sued by I think the district attorney in Los Angeles for these illegitimate claims. So you do want to make sure your website is accessible to anyone who can qualify and pay the rent. My suggestions are to have a third party conduct a compliance audit. There are companies that will do this, and you want to make sure it is a company that has expertise and is willing to testify should a lawsuit occur. You also want to make sure that your policies and terms and conditions are current on your website. Sub-website development companies have a suite of products that will help make sure that your website is accessible and compliant. I would recommend having a third party look at that as well.
Awesome. Thank you. Moving on to trend 4, assistive animals. This is one of those ever pervasive areas that will probably always make a trend list and be on our radar, especially as legislation has changed to become more inclusive. It's definitely challenging to keep up with how to comply. Brian, I know there's been some commotion around verifications and compliance. What's your perspective here?
Yeah, so HUD in January 2020, it kind of got lost, once the pandemic hit, but HUD issued guidance regarding assessing a person's request to have an animal as a reasonable accommodation. The guidance provides clarification on what is a service animal or a support animal and what documentation is acceptable when you're making a request and how to process those requests. The guidance provides a step-by-step guide of how to process these requests. So if you have not read the guidance, I'd recommend it. Reach out and we can provide you a link. An important thing to keep in mind is that assistive animals are not pets. So there's no pet deposit, no pet rent should be charged. Assistive animals can be service animals that are trained to perform a certain task or tasks, or can be support animals and provide, for example, emotional support to a resident. There are certain questions you can ask for each type of animal. So make sure that your people are trained in how to handle these requests. Not only should management, on-site management directly handling the requests be trained, but maintenance workers should as well, so that they know what to look for and how to react to these types of requests.
Great. Mark, I know you've got some examples of field experiences with the maintenance team here, so take it away.
Yeah, so something that comes up often in pool classes is, can we, when people come from the property, is it okay? So they're kind of leading the question almost. Is it okay to have a pet swim day? And the answer is no. It violates so many health codes. We could have a conversation about it for a long time. And so anything with residents bringing their animals on the pool deck, they can have service animals because they're not considered a pet, but they still can't swim. Now, do you want to be the person that says that? I don't know, right? We can have a long conversation about that. But overwhelmingly, if the animal is there for service or support of some kind, there should be a verification process. And whether that's a standard, hey, we have to ask, I just need to make sure we do this for everyone, is I have to verify if that's a service animal, support animal, and just so you know, they can't go in the pool. But those things happen very often. And, it helps with the staff too, is if someone has a service animal, they shouldn't be treated like a pet, because it's very difficult to resist walking into a home and there's a dog and you want to give them a treat, or you want to pet them, or you want to socialize with them. And you can type in the chat, what are some of the most unusual animals that are considered service and support animals? And I've seen everything from pigs to monkeys to dogs, small horses. And the other thing is, you don't want to come across jaded, like another person with a service animal, right?
Trying to get away with no pet deposit, right?
Yeah, and when people can game the system, some people will try. And that's just the nature of some human beings. But I would definitely be careful with this and make sure that people know the difference between them. And I also find that if you get it before it happens, it's a lot easier to deal with than after the fact. So like when people are coming in during their orientation of moving into the property. But please don't let pets swim in the pool. It violates so many health codes and regulations. And, that's the last thing you want to happen. So I would definitely have that conversation with everybody.
Yeah.
And one more item on that, and the only thing I really have to add is that you can enforce some animal rules. In other words, barking or aggressive behavior, the animal still needs to have, whatever vaccinations are required in the municipal area. And then the other thing is to not get confused between a service animal and an assistance animal, because there is training, very specific training for a service animal, but an emotional support animal may not even realize it's an emotional support animal. So looking for a certificate is just that's not part of the verification process. And remember that there needs to be, 36 states right now. My last look showed me 36 states have got some kind of either fine or charge against people who are faking service animals. So I think we're starting to turn the corner on legitimizing the need for the people who really do need them, because when they need them, they need them. And we're not verifiers. We can't do that. So.
Yeah, I saw a question pop up, Jessica, and that is, so to be clear, can we have a pet swim day? And my answer would be not to have a pet swim day. So there's a few reasons for it. Pets usually, not always, but usually are covered in fur, which will carry some amount of fecal matter, plus whatever treatment, chemicals, fleas, treatments, whatever you put on them. And then it's stuck in the filter and it will just circulate through the system until it's gone. So I would definitely find a different place to let your pets swim other than a pool.
Great. Well, requests for accommodation or modification, like we just talked about, can be tricky, especially since the requester doesn't need to directly ask, fill out a form, say a magic word. They simply need to imply that an accommodation or modification is needed, which is enough to trigger that request process. Brian, how can companies mitigate risks with requests?
So yeah, again, it's going back to having policies and procedures and make sure that you have frequent and ongoing training. A lot of companies, again, separate training for office and maintenance workers. I would recommend having them train together so they're on the same page in regard to this issue. Policies and procedures should be up to date and followed. If you don't have a written policy regarding handling reasonable accommodation requests, like we mentioned before, it can hurt you in a government agency complaint or a lawsuit. If you have a policy and procedure that's not followed, it's evidence that's going to be used against you. So utilize form documents as well. I think Sue and Mark would agree with that. If you have to remember requests, like Jessica was saying, requests don't need to be in writing from the resident, but you want to make sure that the request is documented. So having your own form document, if someone comes in and requests an accommodation, or modification, and they don't want to write it down, you write it down for them in the form document that you have so that you have some documentation in regard to that request.
Absolutely. And their requests can come in many different shapes and sizes. And it's not just limited to what you see on your screen. It's important to remember that only the requester knows what the requester needs to equally enjoy their community just like anyone else. And we've alluded to, the attitude and perceptions from property managers that get a little bit jaded. I mean, if you can just close your eyes really quick and think back to your first year in property management when you believed people, it was just a great year. But something happens that on day 366, where we just decided we're not going to take it anymore and everybody is lying. And unfortunately, we don't want to hold the masses accountable for the few and stick with the facts of each request. Follow your process and don't let your personal feelings lead you down a discriminatory path. People need what they need. And like this panel of experts has said, let's let the expert verifiers determine that information.
The only thing can I just add to that slide before you move forward, and I know we're watching our time, is that we need to just be ready to be interactive. HUD requires that we use an interactive process, that we think creatively, and maybe even you have to get a third party consultant involved to give an opinion. But if you think about unit transfer, somebody has PTSD and they need a unit transfer, you're going to see all kinds of a variety of requests. I'm sure that if people put them in the chat box, we would be amazed at some of the requests that we've got. Air purifying, assigned parking as opposed to handicap parking. And I think the caution there is to just be willing to listen and be welcoming at intake. That point of intake, which is where the person initially raises their hand and says, I need help or I need something. That's where really the policy has to be clear that we are happy to help individuals who are requesting, could you clarify for me? Let's talk about that. And so that you're welcoming that conversation, not immediately going, oh my goodness, we've never done anything like that before. That's just counterproductive.
Yeah, thank you, Sue. That was great. So with that new outlook in mind, let's move on to trend 5. Is COVID really a disability? We have never seen a transmittable disease meet HUD's definition of a disability, which is an impairment that limits or makes difficult one or more of life's major functions. This means that impacted folks could also qualify to submit accommodations and modifications. So Brian, let's start at the beginning. how can COVID be considered a disability?
So there have been multiple studies, COVID and what they're calling long COVID, where people have mild cases and then they have issues related to those mild cases over time. They've been shown to exacerbate existing disabilities, introduce new disabilities in previously healthy people. So in general, the analysis in regard to disability is the same whether the person had COVID or they didn't. If a person requests an accommodation or modification, then you go through your policies and procedures to evaluate the request and make a determination. If a person who looks healthy comes to you and says, I need a downstairs unit because I'm having a hard time going up and down the stairs, you go through the same process as you did before. Is the disability readily apparent? If not, then you obtain verification of the disability and the disability related need for the request. COVID's become a political issue as well. You and your employees need to realize that your reactions cannot be political. This is where it is extremely important to have your employees trained on these issues and have policies and procedures and form documents in place as well.
Awesome. Mark, I know you've got some thoughts here too about personal experience and separating yourself from that.
Yeah, the thing is, with standards or policies and processes, it's not personal, and don't make it personal and don't take it personal. And it's easy to say that, right? And this is where the training comes in too, is your mindset is just as important as your skill set. And we have to understand that when we do these together, like Brian spoke about, you'll generate questions between each other and scenarios that you would never do otherwise because you're constantly separated from each other when you're training. And so this is the tip of the iceberg. We really don't know what's coming, but we can see that something is. And there's a difference between a reaction and responding. And you want everyone on your team to respond, which means it's been given thought thoroughly in the way that you approach things, and that you take all the personal responses out of it. And it's as professional and as courteous as can be, personable, but not personal, right? And so going forward, we're going to have to deal with all of these things, and who knows what we're going to have to deal with. But from my experience, when people on site know there's a way to claim something to benefit them, and they learn how they can do that, oftentimes they will. That doesn't mean everybody will, but it's going to affect the way that we move. It may affect the products and services that we provide due to this new disability that people have, whether that's paint, landscaping, the timing of services. Who really knows what it means? And so please train. And I can tell you this as a coach too, just people that train win far more than people that don't. And it doesn't matter what endeavor and discipline it is. And one of the things I would ask, like everyone on this call, to really consider is how many hours your team gets training. So and I would like to make this statement, and I'd love to follow up with it, but certifications are not training. They're transfers of liability, right? So the training itself, like if you look at every training organization there is in the industry, service industries across the board, the minimum time is at least 1 week, 40 hours of training. Multifamily is less than 11. So I would really like us all to work together to get the realistic resources so we can have the realistic expectations and deliver realistic results. So we will do our best to stay ahead of the curve. And as the iceberg emerges, we'll try to keep everyone ahead of it. But that would be, my request right there is just to please get training to people more, and don't take anything personal, although it may affect you personally.
Yeah, I mean, you're definitely speaking Grace Hill's language. Go ahead, Sue. I know you've got some great thoughts.
As we close out this section, I think that there are two things here that really are the big gray areas, and one of them is we don't know a lot yet about long COVID, and so we don't know whether it's going to manifest. The disability is going to manifest itself in breathing issues, headaches, mobility issues, hearing, thinking. I think we're still uncovering the symptoms. So that's a gray area. And then the other gray area is that at what point are you getting burned out on COVID? We did an absolutely phenomenal job with being urgent and urgently responding, starting in this time in 2020, 2 years ago. And now we're cycling through and starting our 3rd year in this. So there is we're having to change from an emergency response to a chronic ongoing response. And that's exhausting. And it's also, demoralizing. It's like, oh my gosh, what next? So I think we have to be realistic when we do come up with those policies. And I think Mark is right. We need to get the team together and talk it through and be together as a unified operating unit in order to be able to support each other. Absolutely.
And a lot of those tips that you all just shared goes into how we stay ahead of the curve and, are prepared for this changing landscape. So some of this we did cover, but I'd love to hear just final thoughts on how we stay ahead of the curve as it relates to COVID and fair housing.
Sure, I'll go first. I think, like we've talked about, we are not doctors. We are not healthcare providers. Let the healthcare experts take care of determining whether or not someone is disabled. We can't make that determination for someone else. So in a housing environment, you see a residence every day. It can be easy to say, oh no, here comes Joe again. He's going to request something different today, and dismiss that person's request. And then that will lead inevitably to a lawsuit. So I think the days of having rigid policies and procedures, your policies and procedures have to be adaptable to different situations. And I think, the framework for determining, whether someone needs a reasonable accommodation request related to a disability, it needs to be adaptable.
Yeah, I think, just with all of this, of course, we can talk to training. We could have our own seminar on that, really, quite honestly. But I think the thing is, if you're watching this, you'd like to write something down, make sure you never become disassociated from the needs and experiences of the field. So for example, if a manager or regional or VP or whoever doesn't really interact with the people on site and hear direct feedback and then respond with what they need, they're really setting their team up for failure. And so the more you're disassociated from the daily routines of your team, the more likely you are to experience these difficulties, and they'll be unexpected. So get people the tools they need. And sometimes the tools are more training. It's not just what you put in a tool belt when bring to a service call. It's what you put in your responses and the understanding and perspectives that come along with that. So I think stay associated with the field and get people what they need. And it's very rarely, I don't know of an instance where training doesn't help or make someone better at something at least once. Even if it's a gem that you get from that day, just take it. It could be very valuable. So I think just staying associated with the field and getting people what they need would make a huge difference immediately.
The only other thing I would cap that off with is just that first bullet there. Just stick to the HUD definition of disability. And again, to Brian's point, we are not healthcare providers. We can't determine that. Every fair housing attorney that I've ever worked with has always said, use a form. You can't require the form, but by using a form, you're being more consistent in the line of questioning that you have. And with long COVID, we don't know all the answers. So it makes it even more precipitous if we don't know the answer. So just remember to use the definition and let the verifier create the nexus or the connection, remember, between what they're asking for and the disability. Not something I can do.
Wonderful. I'm sure you all can see why this is the panel of all panels. And as we navigate uncharted territory, I would love to hear just some final pieces of advice of how we stay in compliance with the future of fair housing. Brian, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. So when I worked in-house for property management companies, my first introduction to multifamily, one of the things I heard often was, this is how we've always done it. And I learned over time that you should immediately investigate that issue, evaluate the policy. It could be okay, but most of the time I found that the policies where they said this is how we've always done it they're not okay. Laws change, our policies and practices and procedures and our training needs to change as well. Like I said, we need to be adaptable, and again, document. That's all I can really say. And in this environment, compassion and empathy are the best customer service advice that I could give is just have compassion for people, have empathy for, what they have experienced the last 2-3 years.
Yeah, a couple things, just if you could think about and ask your team, like, what overwhelms you? What makes you just think, oh my goodness? And very often it's paperwork and processes. So don't make an abundance of them just for the sake. Have that balance and really be selective and purposeful in what you choose to employ in the field, because the more that you require, the more it takes away from their ability to generate other results. So we have to figure out where we're going to dedicate energy. And this is an important topic. This should not be overlooked, but we don't want to overwhelm our technicians in the field as well, because when you make change, it generates anxiety. And if you don't address that anxiety with resources or training or something, it's going to generate turnover. And we don't want to do that. And, the thing is, like with your team, they want meaningful changes. Management wants meaningful changes, purposeful changes. What we don't want is pizza with false promises. We want to have, like, for lunch, right? We want to see actual measurable change in the field. And we don't want to pile on people in the field. We just want you to do a better job and eliminate the likelihood of any of these things happening in a negative way. And so I'm glad we're on this and we have the opportunity to speak.
I'm gonna speak to just two of those bullets in terms of the future of fair housing. The third one, disability. Has anybody heard about device separation anxiety? That actually is being discussed as rising to the level of a disability. Gaming, you've heard stories about people who have lost their livelihood because they can't get away from the gaming. So watch for especially lifestyle related disabilities that are being discussed. So, I mean, the need to stay in training once a year is almost like not enough anymore, because there's so many things that are changing about that. And then the last thing, of course, is I have to preach my sermon again about documentation, because even irrelevant, stepping away from fair housing, when you walk to a conciliation table with an administrative law judge and you've got somebody who's alleging that you're horrible and you've violated fair housing laws against me, and you prove that by never taking care of your property, blah, blah, blah. You walk in with either a digital, and for me, it's mostly a paper file, document production. You walk in with a stack of documentation for how you not only care for the property, but document that line of caring. And you can just see, I actually saw it, the wind go out of the sails on the prosecuting attorney. They just go, oh, geez. Okay, so document.
Awesome. We have a couple minutes to take a few questions. We're getting so many great comments, lots of great takeaways and timely information. This is just such a rock star panel. Thank you all for your expertise today. So if anyone has a few questions, we've got time to take a couple. So I'll just give you a couple minutes to type anything in. Maybe they're marinated on it. And we kind of joked about this when we were rehearsing. We were either, if there was no questions, that means we were really thorough, or everyone is just overwhelmed in processing information. Oh, we've got a question from Linda. Can we require a third-party verification form after getting an ESA doctor note?
Well, I would say that ESA doctor note is probably the third-party verification that you need.
Right.
regarding evaluating the requests. So I would say that doctor's note is probably the one. But again, take a look at the HUD guidelines, the HUD guidance on service animals and assistive animals. It's very helpful, and it has a step-by-step process to follow as well.
There are a number of third-party verifiers now that for a fee paid for by the resident, they will run the traps for you.
Yeah. We'll keep taking questions, but I do want to make sure that if anyone is, getting ready to jump off, that they've got the information with how to contact you wonderful folks. So everyone's contact information is here, and you can see that we've got an opportunity to register for our next webinar. We've got another question, I think, looking for the link.
I think it's in the chat box.
It's in the chat. Yes.
You just scroll through, the link should be in there.
Well, and if you don't, Google HUD January 28th, 2020 guidance, and it'll pop up.
Yep. I've got another one from Sherry. Can we revisit parking? How to handle requests for reserved spaces?
It's really just kind of the same analysis. Someone requests an accommodation to have a parking space assigned near their unit. Then if the disability is not readily apparent, then you request verification of the disability. You still may need verification of the disability related need for the request. But at the same time, if it's someone that you observe having a hard time, walking around, ambulating, you may not need that verification of the disability related needs. So I would say, just follow your policies and procedures, make sure that you have training on them as well.
I do have just one question for everyone here, kind of like a take home action item. Do yourself a favor, and as soon as you get off this or the next time you're in the office, please, or log in, and please take a look at the very last time your policies and procedures were updated. And if it's more than 1 year, I would go see someone right away about it. And because they are almost really, truly are living, breathing documents, and they need to be constantly updated all the time. So if you have to knock the dust off, that's probably one indication, but definitely, see when they were updated and do your best to keep up with them as much as possible.
Yep.
Excellent.
Yeah, I had a company that I worked with that showed me their policies and procedures. It said 2018 was the last date that they updated. And I was like, yeah, you need to really, really update those policies immediately and then train people on it.
Absolutely. And I see a comment also in the chat that Policy Partner can help you with that. And yes, they can. We did throw up Graceful's compliance suite of information on fair housing. We are very, very grateful to be considered one of the industry leaders in compliance and fair housing. So we've got you covered if you are a customer. And Grace Hall has an amazing policy partner to purchase. Yeah, we really do make sure that we try our best to provide you with the most up-to-date information industry-wide. One of the things I love about this group is our collective passion for multifamily. And with that, we are at the top of the hour. Thank you so much, Sue, Brian, and Mark, for your expertise and your time today. You impacted so many people, and there's so many great comments about how informational and wonderful you all were. So thank you, and have a great rest of your day, and happy Fair Housing Month.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Thank you. Take good care.